Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. Delighted to welcome you to this event this afternoon on the government's use of science in the coronavirus epidemic. And that's going to be with Greg Clark, Chair of the Science and Technology Committee. And I'll introduce him in a moment. Let me go through some of the very basic housekeeping rules right at the start. We are obviously on the record. The hashtag is IFG Science, and you can also follow us on Twitter at IFG Events. And we are taking questions via Slido. So to submit your question, go to slido.com and then enter the code 8849, which I hope you could see on your screen now. And please do start sending them now, because there tend to be a lot. They bunch up towards the end, and then we're picking through the best ones. So please do start sending them. Well, with that, I'm delighted to welcome Greg Clark, who has made a great impact as the chair of the Science and Technology Committee. And obviously it has had a lot to say during the past year of crisis. He was also, of course, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy from 2016 to 2019, and has had many, many other ministerial posts, including Minister for Cities, Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Minister of State at the Cabinet Office, Minister for Universities and Science, and Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. So a great deal of experience there to bring to bear on this question, which in many ways has been the question of the day, and one that people in all kinds of walks of life, and you can hear people talking about it as you pass them in the parks and streets and so on, how to use science in making the decisions that affect absolutely everyone in the country. Well, with that, very warm welcome to Greg Clark.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the work that the IFG has done in this area. You were kind enough to say that we've had an impact. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the COVID has had an impact on the work of the committee. It was just over a year ago when the committee was elected, and our work programme was expected to be on the core but fascinating business of science and technology, and we weren't expecting that we would have the opportunity to ask on behalf of our colleagues in Parliament questions throughout the pandemic of not just the scientists in this country, but care of Zoom calls like this, witnesses from around the world. And I think the reflection that I would make, and we published a report a few weeks ago on this that we can go into more details, is first of all to be extraordinarily grateful for the wealth of scientific expertise and excellence and the tradition of that we have, and the committee has drawn on it extensively, not just hearing from those advising government through SAGE and other groups, but for people outside that might have different perspectives, so that we've been able to get I think a rounded picture which we've communicated to colleagues. The second thing to say is that we concluded in the report, and as you know, select committees are cross-party, and we all agreed that the government has been serious about science through the pandemic, and that it's made a serious attempt to convene serious scientists and to take seriously their advice. Now, that's not to say that mistakes and missteps haven't been made by everyone in this pandemic. I think if we reflect back a year ago, it would be astonishing if we hadn't. But in terms of the volition and the motivation, we felt that there was a seriousness of purpose here. And the third thing that I would say is that during that period, it's been extraordinarily demanding on scientists, not just those who are on the payroll of the government one way or another, like the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer, although their dedication and public service during this has been exceptional. But many people right across the UK science base have essentially devoted the whole year and most of their waking hours to help give us the best advice to how to proceed, and so we've benefited from that. There are some headline lessons that we can go into, but we're conscious at this stage. We've got a committee. My committee has an inquiry with the Health and Social Care Select Committee that's chaired by Jeremy Hunt, and we've been taking evidence on some initial lessons learned, and we'll be publishing the conclusions of that during the spring. So I don't want to anticipate our conclusions there, but just in terms of some headline reflections from my perspective as chair of the Science and Technology Committee, I think one of the first things to share, and I know the IFG have shared this in their report, is that transparency and openness about science has helped. And insofar as we started off not as transparent as we are now, that's to say SAGE papers were not published, SAGE minutes were not published, SAGE membership was not published. The committee put some pressure on SAGE and Sir Patrick Vallance to be more transparent. He agreed to do that, to take some of these measures. And so far from that having been a problem, I think it's enhanced the credibility of the advice that the government has been given. I suppose a second reflection is that one of the lessons we can draw from the first year so far is that one of the key challenges is that of anticipation, whether it's test and trace, where we didn't have the capacity in place early enough and didn't anticipate in the early autumn the increased need for that, or conversely, on the development and deployment of vaccines, where I think there has been a substantial and very effective anticipatory program. That is one of the key features of a successful response to the pandemic, it seems. And perhaps a third reflection before we perhaps go into a conversation around this is that the distinction between what might have been traditionally termed as the pure scientific and what might have previously been thought of as the operational or the logistical. I think the experience has shown is that difference is sometimes unhelpful and has caused some problems. So just to refer to the test and trace problems, committee felt that in the early days, the capacity that we had for testing and tracing was too much inclined by the scientific advisors included to be taken as a given, and that the level of capacity dictated the strategy, whereas if we had looked more as to what was possible around the world, a greater imperative to develop that capacity might have helped and might have been a more prominent part of advice. But there are some very broad reflections which are, I'm very conscious, delivered through the lens of hindsight, which was not available at any point during this pandemic until relatively recently. And so our lessons learned.
Thanks very much for that. And your point about hindsight. Sorry. Yeah, your point about hindsight is one that we've all got to repeat in triplicate, because obviously some things are easier to talk about now than they were at the beginning. But all the same, if we can go back to the beginning, you've said that you think the government was serious about science. On the other hand, the report that your committee put out has pointed to ways in which the government, all right, with hindsight, might be said to have been slow. And it wasn't at that point the scientists who were, in any sense, putting on the brake. It was other kinds of considerations about, well, maybe a degree of incredulity, a degree of not wanting to encroach on people's freedoms, certainly concerned about the economy and so on. But it wasn't the science that was saying slow down, don't go into lockdown, and so on. And so if you look back at those early months of treating of how the government handles science. How would you characterize it?
Well, so I
they
think
talked a lot about
back,
following the science. On the other hand, did they?
Yeah, I think one of the big unknowns at the beginning of the pandemic was how quickly the response needed to be. We now know, through the benefit of hindsight, that the quicker the better. But I don't think on the part of anyone, including the scientists, that what we know now about the pace of response was as evident then. Neil Ferguson, in evidence to the committee, said that if we'd had the lockdown earlier, then that would have saved many lives. But the advice, and looking back at the sage advice at the time, there was a sense of bringing on or turning on some of the restrictions gradually, in keeping pace, as it were, with the rate of transmission, rather than pressing all the buttons at the same time. And there were good reasons that the government, I think, was alive to the difficulties of doing that. But the scientific advice reflects that. You'll recall that it was very much framed in terms of flattening the curve during those early weeks. And then only later was there, I think, a much more full spectrum response. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, on the science, amongst the science advice on SAGE were behavioral scientists, and it wasn't known that the level of compliance with very stringent restrictions would be as great as it was. It was the adherence to the measures was greater than the scientists expected. And I think that one of the reflections that the committee made was that in some ways, if you take a scientific approach, then it's grounded in evidence. And sometimes it takes a little while for that evidence to be collected, analyzed, and formed into recommendations. And that may have delayed some of the initial speed of response.
What do you make of this point about how to balance scientific advice with economic concerns, with concerns about deaths from things that aren't coronavirus, with mental health, with loss of education, all these things? Do you think the government has now begun to get that into balance in the explanation that it offers people?
Well, Bronwyn, I think it has from the outset, which is one of the reasons why some of those early measures were not taken perhaps in the full spectrum way that they could have been. There was a concern for the wider impact. And many of the witnesses, including Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, have said to us that the real measure of the impact of COVID includes excess deaths. It includes deaths from other factors than directly from COVID, whether that is from people not being able to access treatment or diagnosis for other conditions, through to the effect of unemployment on people's lives in that sense. So that is understood. But one of the points that the committee has made is that there's much less transparency over the assessment of the wider impacts than there is now on the epidemiology and the medical aspects. There is great transparency. The SAGE papers are now published, they're very clear, but we don't have the same level of transparency about the assessment on, for example, the wider NHS, and still less on the impact on employment and the economy. And it seems to us, and we recommended in our report, that we should have the same candor of assessment on those matters as we do on the what we might describe as the more narrowly scientific aspects.
And you'd extend that to things like education and the loss of education, to mental health, to loss of some industries and so on.
Yes, what we've seen throughout the pandemic on scientific advice is it's been published, it's been disclosed, it's been discussed widely. I think people have a sense that these decisions are complex and difficult, but people have a sense of how they're being made. I think some aspects of the wider impact don't benefit from that same transparency, and I think that they're very important, and they should.
What should we make of the fact that about half of the country's deaths from coronavirus have happened since the middle of November? And when other countries look at us, as they do all the time, and I'm going to come on to vaccines in a moment, but this is on the less cheerful point of the number of deaths, that a lot have happened relatively late in the day, when presumably some of these lessons should have been learned. And this is from a government putting great emphasis on its use of science.
That's true, Bronwyn, but I don't want to exceed the reflections that we've made as a committee on this. What we've been looking at is principally before then, and no doubt we will look into what are the causes and what this can be attributed to. Clearly, the experience of the new variants is one of the features in that. But since the committee hasn't taken evidence on precisely that point, on the most recent level of deaths, then I wouldn't want to kind of freelance on that.
Well, all right, fair play. But if I take you into something that is the heart of what the committee does, which is SAGE itself.
Yes.
And it's something you have looked at. And I think we'd all appreciate your thoughts on SAGE, how it's been working. It's there to give, it's obviously an enormous group of people. In fact, it's really, I think, much larger with all its subcommittees than people sometimes realize. It's there to give the government, in the end, a kind of agreed view. On the other hand, all these scientists have their own independent reputations. They pop up individually on the media. And I wondered how you thought this was working.
So I think it's a good thing that science and scientists have been prominent within this. The first thing is to say is that when people talk about the science, as you know, Bronwyn, that there is no such thing as the science. It is the essence of science is that it is vigorous, contested, and people put forward theories that are then subject to very rigorous examination, and that is the basis of our scientific excellence. And SAGE, I think, has reflected that. It isn't a group of just 2 or 3 handpicked people. I think there's been a serious attempt by Sir Patrick and others to bring together experienced and eminent people in the relevant fields. Nor has there been any attempt to suggest that there is a single view there. Sir Patrick Vallance has been very clear with the committee that what he and Chris Whitty have done as the co-chairs is to distill the advice to be given to government, but not to pretend that it's uniform advice. And so that I think is a mature and healthy reflection of the different perspectives. And consistent with that, my view is that having scientists appear in the media on public platforms to talk about their own work and to explain directly what their views and thoughts are on particular aspects of the pandemic, I think that's a good thing, and I would not want to see a restriction on people's ability to speak, perhaps even when they take a different view from the actions that have been taken by government under advice.
Obviously, turning to one of the more cheerful points, the UK is getting a great deal of relief, I would say pleasure, from the performance of vaccines and some of the homegrown vaccines as well. How much of that, there was government support for some of the Oxford venture at really a very early stage, long before coronavirus came on the scene. What do you think the UK can do from this point to build on those and encourage this kind of thing?
Well, I think there will be lessons to learn from the success of the vaccines program. First of all, that success depends crucially on the existence of a very strong and deep and broad science base in this country, and that is something that shouldn't be taken for granted, but needs to be prized and needs to be invested in. But on top of that, I think there was an agility on the part of government and the funding bodies to fund well the development of potential vaccines, and that was absolutely right and appropriate. The regime we have in this country of clinical trials, again, has been carefully developed and developed further during this pandemic to be agile, whilst rigorous, and to be world leading in terms of being a good place to assess potential new vaccines and treatments. So I think that's been very effective. And then I think what I referred to earlier is the anticipation, the work that the Vaccines Task Force engaged in anticipating future needs at risk before it was even known that any of these vaccines would pass the hurdle of the clinical trials, to start to put in place procurement and indeed manufacturing was, I think, a good exercise of foresight, and it all reflects a very good collaboration between universities, research institutions, the government, private sector, and the NHS, which I think has much to commend itself as to how to proceed in the future.
It doesn't reflect a particularly good collaboration between countries, and this is something we've seen right across the world, of countries wanting to work together, maybe, and scrambling for their own advantage as they come under pressure. What do you think the impact has been of Brexit? And I'm not thinking so much on the distribution of vaccines, but on the distribution of scientists.
Well, I think it's in terms of international collaboration. Actually, the portfolio of vaccines that is now available and is licensed, I think, does reflect actually quite a wide and deep and successful international collaboration. A lot of the trials were done in Brazil, for example, at a time when levels of infection were high there but low here. Many of all of the drugs companies and many of the researchers operated internationally. And I think that has been crucial. I think science doesn't respect boundaries, and scientific collaboration across borders has very clearly been part of the success to date. And even the trials in South Africa, AstraZeneca, on the new variant, show the continuing importance of that. So I think that has been very important. Clearly, I think it's the bodies that bring together nations for other purposes, whether it's procurement or these kind of collective decisions. They clearly have not been working with anywhere near the success that the scientists and the research institutes themselves have, and the lessons of that, I think, need to be reflected on. We're not over this yet, because clearly we're going to get to the point in which the distribution around the world of the available vaccine supplies clearly does require international collaboration, and it's both morally and in terms of our self-interest. We've got a strong interest and strong imperative to do that, and I hope that this may be better than what we've seen during the early months of the level of that international collaboration by institutions bringing governments together.
What about the way in which the UK is acting as a sort of lab for the world in our use of vaccines? the decision to have a 3-month gap between the first and second doses, small tests now about mixing and matching doses, and so on. How do you think the government should make these decisions? And is it now part of what Global Britain offers to the world, a kind of agility, but an ability to treat itself as an experiment?
Well, so I think it's agility rather than to treat itself as an experiment. The key thing is that these are done, these trials and the licensing decisions are done rigorously. And I think it's because the MHRA, for example, has a high and unimpeachable reputation for rigor and integrity, as does the institutions that have participated in this, and the oversight of clinical trials in this country are acknowledged to be of high standard. That I think is an asset for us, and the fact that we have in this country a collection of individuals and institutions that are able rapidly to develop and test new treatments and drugs, I think is an asset for us. In fact, when I was the business secretary that you mentioned at the beginning, we embarked on an industrial strategy, and a key part of that was a life sciences industrial strategy that very much had in mind that we should make use of the thought leadership that we had in these fields to be able to leverage that, and to be a place that researchers from around the world could either work in or work with to the benefit of everyone. And so I think that is a positive aspect of it, but it does rest on and require rigorous regulatory standards that we enjoy in this country. And so these decisions are not for politicians, they're not for governments, but they are for the independent regulatory authorities.
What's your committee going to look at next?
So we're looking. We've got our joint inquiry with the Health Committee on lessons learned, as I mentioned. But clearly, our purpose throughout this has been to continue to take evidence on COVID, on the issues of the day. For quite apart from being able to learn the lessons, I think there are a couple of other reasons. One is that it provides the ability for Parliament to ask questions of and understand what is the basis for policy. So we have a session next week on the steps to release some of the lockdown measures, if, when, and how they should be released, and we'll be questioning policymakers and scientists around that. We had a session last week, and we'll be following this up on the test and trace system. It seems to us that as we come out of lockdown, unless and until the virus is eradicated, we're going to rely quite heavily on the effectiveness of the test and trace system. So we want to understand that. So we'll be asking questions and hopefully generating some understanding of the policies that are going to be policy steps that are going to be taken. There's also a feature one can do this all retrospectively at the end of the pandemic, but we think there's a value in interviewing people during the pandemic to capture what was in their thoughts and in their intentions at the time, so that not everything has to be completely through the lens of hindsight. We can understand what people thought at the time, and that's part of our purpose as well. Apart from that, we've got other inquiries. We're about to start a big inquiry into the role of hydrogen in getting to net zero, for example. We are looking at the role of science and technology in recovering from COVID, and we will have many others during the year ahead.
All right, we'll look forward to that. One of the very current questions is about whether the government ought to impose quarantine on people coming from every country, rather than just the list of of 33. And this is something the opposition is pushing very hard on. Does that come within the scope of what you're looking at soon?
Yeah, so we'll be looking at this as part of the inquiry to understand the next steps on this.
It's one where the scientific advice might seem to say, look, a lot of new variants around in the world, and if we're going to get on top of this, we really need to have as tight measures as we possibly can. And yet that isn't quite where the government is at the moment. And we've got reports of division within the cabinet itself on this.
Well, I think it's a little more nuanced than that, in the sense that first of all, in terms of variants, we have an ability to spot variants and understand them more than other countries here. And so one of the things that seems to me we need to do is to make sure that that ability is shared with other countries, because in a global pandemic, having one country alone acting on that information is clearly not as powerful as that being communicated everywhere. The second reflection, through the early course of the pandemic, the advice was not to have a generalized ban on entry, because for much of that time, there were more people as a proportion of the population with COVID within our shores than there were outside. And so if you were to quarantine and to isolate people, actually, those people coming into the country were less likely to have COVID than people within the country. Now, that obviously would change if we get to the position in which we have very low levels of COVID and other places have higher levels. So I think it is contingent on how we are, what the state of the spread of COVID is in this country compared to others.
What do you think ministers ought to understand about things like modelling, statistics, economics, science, if you like? It's something we look at. We offer, if you like, professional development for ministers who often parachuted into their first job without a lot of background in what the subject might be. Now, of course, they may have a scientific background, but they may well not. And from your experience, what would you say they need to know?
I think it would be unusual for a minister, indeed impossible for a minister, to have the depth of knowledge that any of the specialist advisors that they have in this, whether it's modelling or other aspects of the pandemic. It seems to me the key skill and duty of a minister is to be tenacious and thorough in questioning and understanding the basis of the advice that is being given, not simply to accept it and at face value, but really to interrogate it. In all of the ministerial positions that I've held, perhaps we might have some of my officials on the call, but I think they would reflect that if you're to do your job, then you need to ask the difficult questions to satisfy yourself that you've understood the advice, not least if it then falls to you to weigh that advice up against others. We talked about some of the wider impacts. That is something that requires, if you're to do that, if you're to combine them, then I think you need to be pretty versed in the arguments and the evidence and the basis for it.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. You queried right at the beginning my use of the word impact about your committee. Would you like to be back in government?
Oh, I'd love being in government, and anyone that is in public service, I would think would want the chance to be able to put into practice the thoughts and the insights and the experience that you have. And 9 years in government, you develop a lot of experience, and you can't help but think that some of it could be of use. But I'm very privileged to have as chair of the committee, the opportunity in probably the most important issue that the Parliament has faced for a couple of generations, the ability to to play a role in perhaps doing some of this questioning and providing some what I hope is constructive advice to those that have the privilege of being in government.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I would take that as a yes, because it was a yes. Let me get in some questions. We've got some very good ones coming in. Let me start with one from Hartley Miller, who says, and this goes back to your point about the very nature of science. How should the government deal with reasonable, it's in brackets, differing views amongst scientists? How much recognition and explicit discussion is appropriate, and in what forum?
So I think you have to have that. I think you have to license discussion and disagreement. As I say, it's the nature of science, and to pretend that on a question there might be a single view if there isn't, I think would undermine the credibility of the case that was being made. And one of the things that the publication of the evidence that SAGE has taken and the SAGE minutes has, one of the consequences of that is that people have been invited to scrutinize and to see the basis of decisions. And so far from that having undermined confidence in exposing the fact that some people disagree and some people disagree with the papers that have been submitted, actually, I think it's had the opposite effect. I think people see that there are proper scientific discussions that inform advice rather than it being one-dimensional and only those of, as it were, approved views.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that. Got an interesting one from Frank Lovett saying, to what extent do you consider that devolved powers have hindered the UK in its response to COVID-19? And we look around the world, and we look at other countries that have devolved or federal structures, and sometimes I'm thinking of the US, it can look like a complication too far. There are obviously others like Germany where it goes more smoothly. But in our case, what do you think?
So the committee wrote a letter to the Prime Minister in May, and one of the reflections that we made was that the cooperation in the UK between the nations of the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, was a good thing and should continue. And there may be different policies that are pursued by following the political decisions, policy decisions that are made by ministers in the different assemblies. But it would be desirable to have a common approach to scientific advice. And the chief medical officers of the nations have, and they would say to you, I think, have had a very close working relationship, which continues. And so I think that has been effective. Now, what one could say, thinking as a kind of thought experiment, well, what if we had sort of completely different approaches and completely different advice being taken in the different nations? Doesn't this provide a sort of laboratory to see what works best in a kind of similar population? On balance, it seems to be that in terms of trust and confidence, the idea that people are working together from the different nations of the UK, I think that has been a positive thing.
Okay. We could do a whole session almost on that, but and indeed we might, but not right now. Let me take in one from Mark, who says, to what extent do you feel that vaccination should be approached on a more global basis, that is more sharing between countries, especially due to the risks of future virus hotspots leading to variants which could result in vaccine escape?
Clearly, because the pandemic is global, we have a collective interest, as I said, a kind of moral as well as self-interest in making sure the world is protected as soon as possible. I think one of the benefits of the approach that we've taken here in investing in anticipation on multiple different vaccines is that we've accelerated the production and the manufacture of vaccines to the point that we will have more than we need, and that I think puts us in the fortunate position of being able to lead an international conversation as to how we get them into the hands or the arms of those that need them around the world. And I think that is a good position for the UK to be in. But it was based on, I think, a certain vigor and prescience on the part of the domestic authorities here in the UK to invest in that capacity that now puts us in that favourable position. Whereas I think if we had, as we were talking about earlier, I think if we'd waited for a wholly international approach to this through international institutions, then we possibly wouldn't, or I certainly wouldn't be as far advanced as we are, and therefore having the possibility before very long to be able to share the product of this with the rest of the world.
Okay, we've got another one, interesting one from someone who hasn't wanted to give their name, saying, under what circumstances, if any, do you think SAGE outputs should remain confidential?
So I think the principle is that they should be public.
And what outputs is a very abstract word. What do we mean by this? Their considered views, their deliberations.
Well, it's a good question. So there are inputs, so the papers that they consider, they are now published, and there are two sorts of outputs. One is the minutes of the meetings that they have, but the second is the advice to government. Now, what we've recommended is that advice to government should be published as well, not because we think that there is some discrepancy between the two. So the co-chairs of SAGE, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, are people of impeccable integrity, and I'm absolutely certain that they take, as it were, the minuted conclusions of SAGE and they reflect them in their advice to government. I don't believe that they reach an agreement in SAGE and then they advise something completely different, quite the reverse. And indeed, it's because of that, because I'm certain that the advice does reflect their conclusions, that there seems to me to be no benefit in suppressing them. And just as with the publication of SAGE papers and minutes and membership themselves, I think it would add to the sense of confidence in the process of taking scientific advice. So I think as a principle, transparency should prevail.
Yeah, we're not going to argue with that, I have to say. It's something we call for in all our reports. But let me follow that then with someone else who also didn't want to give their name, saying, do you think the formation of the independent SAGE has been helpful? This was a group set up in some exasperation at the performance of the official SAGE.
Yeah, well, it follows from what I said that I don't believe that that people should be suppressed or reticent about debating vigorously the response to the pandemic, including the science of it. That is how science proceeds in that way. I suppose what slightly kind of wrinkled. There's a wrinkle that that I don't warm to, which is the implication that having an independent SAGE, if that is supposed to carry the implication that the official SAGE, as it were, is not independent, then I think that would be unfair and wrong, because it comprises individuals of caliber, of integrity, and is chaired by two people who I think have demonstrated that not just during the crisis, but during their careers. And so I don't care much for that inference if it's there, but it may not be. But I think we should be clear that that it shouldn't imply that. But any groups of people coming together to discuss and publish, I think is fine.
Well, that sounds very wholesome in a way, but doesn't this go to the heart of the problem that a lot of these questions, in fact, are about? which is what is people supposed to make of all this scientific advice? And I absolutely agree that perhaps more of it should be transparent, should be published, and so on. But you've got a lot of scientists out there disagreeing with each other, and then you've got independent SAGE setting itself up to challenge aspects of the way it felt SAGE was giving advice to the government. And then you've got the government on the one hand saying it's taking the scientific advice, and then that is one among many factors, quite understandably. And you've got scientists all over the media, and what guide can you give either people watching all this or the government about how to give people a steer on how to there's lots of people, as we know, watching more news than ever and trying to make up their own opinions on this, and have this torrent of scientists from whom to pick their opinions, if you like. What are they supposed to make of it?
So I think the effect of this, Bronwyn, it has not been a collapse or even a diminution in the standing of science. In fact, quite the reverse. People seeing different points of view, hearing them on the radio, seeing them on the TV, has not led people to think, well, no one knows the answer, we might as well give up. Quite the reverse. I think it reinforces and reflects an adult understanding that people have that the pandemic is new and unknown, and we are learning as we're going, and to kind of level with people that we're progressing towards a deeper understanding, and people coming at it from different perspectives and with different theories is a mature process. And the fact that I draw a lot of comfort and cheer from the fact that people have responded positively to that, frankly, for elsewhere in politics. I think it does demonstrate that you can treat people in an adult way, not be always presentational, but recognize complexity and difficulty, and such that we probably had a greater prominence of science in this country, partly because of the arrangements that we've discussed than other countries, and yet when it came to, for example, adherence to the lockdown restrictions that were advised initially, or more recently, and I don't want to anticipate too much a process that is already underway, but levels of take-up of the vaccines, at least amongst the over 80s and the over 70s, are amongst the highest in the world. And I can't help but think that is, at least in part, a reflection on the volume and depth of scientific spokesmen and women that people have seen over recent months, and that it has added to confidence rather than diminished it.
I want to think you're right, and I kind of do think you're right. But some people I know, if I suggest that kind of thing, say, no, the vaccine take-up is a high response to the level of deaths. In the UK, it's fear, not trust.
I don't want
and the fact is, we do have this, as you said, the government's put a lot of effort into science and talking about science and stuff, and yet for many factors that can be beyond what the government has actually itself done, for example, the amount of traffic, the UK, and all that kind of thing. But the fact is, we do have one of the higher death rates per size of population in the world.
So again, I don't want to kind of speak beyond what we've properly inquired into, and what is the cause of, and what is finally the uptake rate of vaccines is something that I'm sure the committee will want to look into rigorously, and there are, I'm sure, many different variables that contribute to the rate of uptake. But I would observe this, at least, that the exposure of British public to scientists over the last few months does not seem to have been associated with a collapse in confidence in the vaccines. And I would say the opposite. I think there has been communicated a sense of what we've been talking about, that actually we do have rigorous procedures, and when we've had changes to the dosage regime. There have been reasons for it that have been explained and got into and challenged and data brought to bear. And I think this does kind of filter through. It does permeate. And my hypothesis, let me put it this as best, is that the exposure to scientists has built rather than undermined confidence in scientific advice over.
Thanks for that. And I think we'll look at things like the take-up of technical and scientific education coming out of it. And there are signs that it's turned a lot of people on to science, if you like. These things obviously have big cultural roots. I'm thinking of the esteem that the French educational establishment holds science in. And yet, as you said, the degree of, well, you didn't say, but others have, the degree of vaccine skepticism in that country higher than here. Let me go to another one, though, which touches on an interesting point that's flickering around our discussion, which is the sort of unelected nature of scientific experts. And we've got one question that says, is good scientific advice to government too dependent on a few key individuals, such as the chief medical officer and government chief scientific officer, even if it's worked well in the current pandemic? And we had David Runciman, the political scientist, talking after the annual lecture I gave a couple of weeks ago, musing on the one hand, the trust that people do have in experts, if you like, but the wariness that people may have if they don't run for election, as you and your colleagues do.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it isn't just a few individuals, as we talked about, and part of the I think the benefit of disclosing the names of SAGE advisors was that there were many of them through different panels, different committees, but even on the maiden SAGE, there are a lot of people brought to the discussion. So it's not down to just one or two individuals. I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that the two principal individuals, Sir Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, their approach, as described to us and elsewhere, has been very much to take a distillation of what this wider group has said, rather than to be, as it were, sort of personal drivers of policy. And the third thing is that, of course, there will be some selection, even with the wide group of people that have participated in SAGE. There are others that have not been invited to be on SAGE. But that goes to my point about transparency and not being too concerned about voices that disagree with the advice. There are lots of opportunities now. The media provide many platforms for people, if they've got strong views based on their own research and evidence, to have an airing for it, let alone the more sort of learned outlets that are available in the scientific world. So I think throughout the pandemic, there's not been a monopoly or even a kind of narrow oligopoly when it comes to scientific advice. I think this is pretty open, and it's good that it is.
Thanks. We've got one from Dr. Anusha Panjwani, who says, in your point of view, how important is the role of innovative regulations to be prepared for future epidemics or pandemics?
I think it's really important, and again, one of the lessons that we must distill from the success so far of the vaccine program has been the agility, everything from the clinical trials. For example, the MHRA considered the evidence from the clinical trials through a rolling review, so that they could start to look at the data early rather than waiting for it all to be finished and all produced in a package. And that saved several weeks and possibly months in terms of the approval process at no loss of rigor, and may well have saved thousands of lives, and perhaps even more than that across the world, by having drugs, having vaccines licensed perhaps a couple of months earlier than they otherwise would have done. So that seems to me to be a very good feature of it. The fact that there was a serious discussion, and again with some agility, on the dosage regime, and it would have been easy to say, well, the clinical trials were on this basis, we can't be reopening that. But the fact that people were willing to challenge their own thinking and say, well, okay, that might be convenient, but actually, is there any downside to extending the dosage, and would this have benefits? And coming to a point that the advice changed, I think is commendable. So I think there are two areas in which perhaps traditionally things don't get changed from what how they're originally set and initially set. I think we've done that, and it may be we shouldn't think that just because we've done this incredibly briskly over the last year or so, that actually we might be able to do it even quicker in future. Some of the aspects of learning might be to distill that practice and really say, okay, are there any parts of this that we could speed up further? Any things that we could do in parallel rather than in sequence that might mean, whether it's for new variants of COVID or frankly some new and unknown future disease, that we can have a response that is even more agile and therefore even more life-saving than we've been able to be in this.
So let me follow that with one which follows on from that, from Tom Sass, Associate Director at the Institute for Government, who says, how do you think science will be changed by this, and what could scientists themselves learn from it?
So I think the standing of science, I think, can only be further enhanced by this. The fact that we are in the position now to be vaccinating people against a disease that just a year ago we didn't know there was going to be any protection against is an extraordinary achievement. And just as people were inspired by technological achievements such as sending people to space, there will be people who've been engaged, and I think especially young people, in the extraordinary mission to find a vaccine against COVID that I hope will be inspired to lead careers in science as a result. And so I hope there'll be a kind of generational effect there. I think the seriousness of science in our national discourse, again, I hope will be enhanced and expanded. It'll become more routine that we take publicly scientific advice. I think there will be consequences, I hope, for science funding. It seems evident to me that the money that has been invested, both in the discovery research, but also in recent years in things like translating discovery into practice, is literally an investment, and I hope the case for that will be easier in future. And I think some of these questions of anticipation, agility, regulatory innovation, these have applied during this pandemic and specifically on COVID, but I think they have a wider application that I would like the government and us all to be able to kind of codify, to recognize, and to apply in other areas of our national life and policy.
So let me ask you just finally then, whether we should be glad as a country that Pfizer didn't succeed in its takeover bid for AstraZeneca 7 years ago.
Well, I'm personally pleased that AstraZeneca is a British company, a British-Swedish company, and that has got deep roots here in this. And so I do think that is, candidly, I'm very pleased that it remained to be here. But the context of the question is, I guess, whether we should take steps to require that to be the case in future. And that is that's genuinely a challenging question, because the truth is that most of the organizations that are active in this endeavor are multinational. And so I think you're right, Bronwyn, and it does shine the spotlight on that. But I don't think we should infer from this that requiring all companies simply to be resident, as it were, in one country is necessarily the solution. I think it's a very important question. I know the Institute for Government will be reflecting on their lessons for it. I'm pleased that AstraZeneca is here, but I think we need to ask that question as to what the implications are for the future. But let's forget that this is, going back to what we said before, very much an international endeavor.
Well, we will keep asking past and current business secretaries, but and see where the answers go. But Greg Clark, thank you very much indeed for those answers over a wide range of things. And the questions went even wider than that, right across the whole every aspect of the pandemic. And apologies to those I couldn't get in, but we'll try and scoop up your questions in many other coronavirus related events to come. Though that isn't everything we do. But for the moment, we will have to sign off. And so thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and thank you very much indeed, Greg Clark.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thanks everyone for your questions.